So yeah, thanks for the invitation, and it's a good tradition down under to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land where you're based at. So that's what I do here as well. I'm based at the land of the Boonwurrung people. I would like to pay my respect to their elders past and present. And yeah, I'm based at Monash Sustainable Development Institute, which is in Melbourne, one of the suburbs in Melbourne. And I was invited to speak about strategic niche management, and has been a bit of a trip down memory lane in some ways. Wrote my PhD about this a while ago, but before that, there has been a lot of work going on in this area as well. So I really enjoyed the opportunity to go back, and I guess I have to say it's a bit of a biased presentation, like I think any presentation. So there's so much work being published that ultimately will be a bit of my own personal lens, and also a lens through my own projects that I've been working on in this area. So what I'll do, and I've got quite a lot of stuff to go through, so hopefully we'll make it in time. But I'll start briefly with talking about what strategic niche management is and where it comes from and where it sits in the field. Talk a bit about early developments, the initial thinking around strategic niche management, then go into a number of elaborations that have been worked on along the way, particularly more on the politics of strategic niche management, geography, institutional perspectives, and also talk a little bit about SNM in practice and some of the challenges and ambiguities of that work. And I'll end with an outlook of some of my ongoing work at the moment, which for some reason I started to focus a bit more on things like behavior and people and households, and how we can better incorporate this into transitions thinking and strategic niche management. So I thought, when I was preparing the presentation, I thought I'd just go to Scopus, like anyone often does when you have to find out about a particular topic. And it already starts to reveal a little bit about strategic niche management. So as you can see on the left, initial publications, if you just search for strategic niche management, then it sort of starts in 1994. Initially just a few publications per year, but then it increases to maybe something between 15 and 25 publications around the turn of the century. If you look at the most cited articles, you can see that article by René Kemp and Jan Scott in the middle, and Remke Hoogma, regime shifts to sustainability through process of niche formation. And this has become sort of the citation that often is referred to when it's about strategic niche management. So it's one of those foundational citations, if you like. There are a few others there as well. The second one is a paper which is part of a special issue on sustainable innovation journeys, and basically reviews the literature at the time. There's an interesting third one that I'll talk about a little bit more also on later on, but in parallel to strategic niche management, which traditionally had a focus on more market-based, technology-focused niche development. In parallel, there's been quite a lot of work on grassroots innovation, drawing, but also extending the notion of strategic niche management in a different context. And the fourth one I'll highlight is the past and future of constructive technology assessment. This is, I guess, also one of the foundations in the sense that some of the early writings, and this is also reflected in the notion of management as part of the framework. There was an ambition to think about what transition theories could contribute to actually informing policy and governance and management in order to enable regime shifts to sustainability. On the right of this graph are just the journals that where publications have appeared most, and this won't be a surprise if you're working in this area, as these are quite common journals for us. Strategic niche management has often been positioned, and you can question whether that's true or not, but it has often been positioned as one of the four foundational frameworks in the field, next to transition management, the multi-level perspective, and technological innovation systems. And in some ways, you can say, there's some truth in saying it's a foundational framework. If you just look at the most cited papers in this field, using a particular query, in this case from a paper from 2012 by Jochen Market, myself, and Bernard Truffer, that regime shifts paper that I mentioned before is the second highest cited paper in the field. So again, sort of an indication that this SNM framework apparently has been influential compared to some of the other contributions. Also looking at some of the other frameworks, you could say, these are the other three frameworks: transition management, multi-level perspective, and technological innovation systems. They have to some extent been influenced by original SNM thinking and the notion of experimentation, which is a core notion in strategic niche management. So it's part of the transition management cycle as sort of the operational aspect or the operational phases of transition management and transition governance. It's obviously one of the three levels. The niche level is one of the three levels in the multi-level perspective. And it's also considered the notion of experimentation and niche market formation is also part of the technological innovation system thinking as one of the core functions, or two core functions, which draw to some extent on this original early on thinking on niches and experimentation. And also if you look at it a bit more systematically, this is part of a recently published paper by Ned Truffer and the other editors of ICE, including myself, trying to map, and this is only for the Environmental Innovation Society Transition Journal. It has mapped different concepts and frameworks and disciplines, how that has dynamically evolved over time since the journal was established in 2011. And this is the first phase. You can see the niche concept in this, and this I should probably explain a little bit about the methodology and how to read these graphs. It's basically a co-occurrence analysis that you can visually map in a network, and basically concepts that are more in the center of the graph means that they are often well connected with the other concepts that are there. If they're more on the side, in the periphery of the graph, then it means they're more to the periphery of the field, if you like. Bigger circles means it's more attention to these concepts compared to smaller circles, and the relationships with some of the other concepts are visible in this graph as well. So in this first period, you can see that the niche concept was a very central concept in the field, and obviously closely related to the multi-level perspective, the socio-technical regime concept and the landscape concept to the other two levels in the field. And then SNM closely related to transition management, a little bit more on the periphery of the field. And this doesn't change a lot when you browse through the last decade or so of ICE. The niche concept remains that moves a little bit out of the center. SNM sort of remains in the periphery of the center. It remains connected to notions of transition management. Psychology and learning tends to be related to these kinds of concepts. Same here, the 2017-2019 period. It's related to notions of consumers and users and markets. Again, learning is there. And this is the last period. Again, sort of, not much is changing. All right. So it remains a little bit sort of in the periphery, somewhat in the core and the periphery of the field. It's been around for quite a while now. So what is strategic niche management from that perspective? I guess one assessment would be to say, well, it's not the newest kid on the block, but perhaps it's a cornerstone of the transition building. And it never reached that phase where it became the multi-level perspective, I would say, which has lots and lots of attention and continues to be a structuring framework. But it has been there for a while and continues to be there, and it has informed other frameworks in its thinking. Before I move on to talking a little bit more about the content of the framework, it's good to know that this notion of experimentation, which I already briefly alluded to earlier on, is a key notion in strategic niche management. And in particular, over the last maybe 5 years or 7 years, that notion has boomed as well as a sort of a separate, almost independent notion in the literature, also because scholarship elsewhere started to talk about experimentation in its own right and in its own disciplinary terms. In particular, urban geography has been doing a lot of work on urban experimentation as well. And lots of this work has been published along the way in several books. You see here the original book by Harriet Bulkley and colleagues on the urban politics of climate change, which looks at experimentation as a mode of governance. a book from 2016 that I co-edited on the experimental city and tried to make sense of how cities increasingly are using experimentation also as a way of governing urban transformation processes. A book by Simon Marvin on urban living labs, a book by Bruno, I think so Bruno was online, about innovating climate governance and moving beyond experimentation. And also a special issue by Leah Fumschilling, Nikki Franciskaki, and Lars Kuhne around urban experimentation and sustainability transitions. On the left, you see a graph that Franz Sengers, former PhD student and colleague, has worked on doing a bit of a bibliometrical analysis of experimentation, in particular within the transitions field specifically. So it's not looking at what was happening in other fields or disciplines, and sort of trying to distinguish between different types of writing and disciplinary backgrounds and thinking in terms of experimentation. And won't go into details, but the color coding, basically the blue color coding is sort of, I'd say, the traditional SNM way of talking about experimentation. Then the yellow coding is more the notion of transition experiment, as it was used and is used in the context of transition management. The red color coding is referring more to that grassroots and social experimentation literature, and then the green on the right side is literature that looks at sustainability experiments in the context of rapidly developing Asian countries and economies, and that Franz Burkhardt and Anna Wieczorek and others have worked on. So that's just as a side note, but it's so closely related to the literatures and the histories of strategic niche management that it's good to make that explicit here as well. So what is strategic niche management? It has been defined as the creation, development, and control phase out of protected spaces for the development and use of promising technologies by means of experimentation, with the aim of learning about the desirability of the new technology and to enhancing the further development and rate of application of the new technology. So I made some of these words red here because I think they are important. Control, it's referring to some kind of managerial governance approach to experimentation. The notion of protected spaces, which is basically another way of saying niches, and I'll come back to that a little bit later as well. The notion of use, it's lots of attention on experimentation and niches in terms of also looking at the role of the demand side and the role and the influence of users in technological change and innovation. Promising, so lots of these technologies are still hopeful monstrosities. They are talked about in terms of future applications and future possibilities, and that actually is a part of the active social dynamics that happen within niches and niche creation and experimentation. Also learning, one of the key processes, and new technologies, in the sense that much of the original SNM had a particular focus on technological innovation. So what are some of the foundations of strategic niche management? This goes back quite a long time. I guess there's sort of three ways of thinking that have been influential in putting this framework together. One is evolutionary economic theories, and that is a literature that has been influencing quite a lot of thinking in the transitions field in general. Basically, making a distinction between sort of drawing on biological evolution as a mode of explaining change, referring to variation, selection, and retention, where variation refers to new varieties of technologies through innovation, through research and development. These varieties are then selected within markets, but also within the structures of broader policy and societal conditions. And retention referring to the fact that some of these things that work and are successful on markets or within policy settings and societal settings, that retention then occurs through shared heuristics and routines that structure future developments in a particular technological area or technological domain, and that leads to particular sectorial patterns, such as trajectories, regimes, or paradigms. The second foundational literature is basically drawn on science and technology studies, and this is has been emphasizing more the role of actors and agency in the strategic niche management framework, and drawing more attention to the use of the demand, to the use and the demand side of technological change, which was complementary to evolutionary economic theories. And this has also been coined, therefore, as a quasi-evolutionary perspective rather than a pure evolutionary perspective. And what this means is that because technological change occurs not as a sort of blind, automated biological mechanism, but through people and through engineers and through policymakers and through users, it's not a blind process, but anticipations and expectations about what might work and what might not work. And through learning and feedback mechanisms, it's a quasi-evolutionary perspective. And it's in the sense that, for instance, engineers working in R&D departments, they anticipate what might possibly be successful in the future application of new technologies and innovations. And this, at this point, this quasi-evolutionary point was originally made by, I think, Van der Belt and Ira Rippin already in 1987, going a long way back. And then finally, there's a history of technology as a disciplinary background, and in particular, the idea of looking at trying to understand how transitions happen in the past through empirical histories, the notion of niches and how they play an important role, and then theorizing and conceptualizing that empirical work has been informative in the development of the framework. So what are the basic propositions? Sustainable innovations face multidimensional barriers. So it's not just a matter of getting the economics right or getting the technological feasibility right, but it's also about things like user routines, cultural norms, the policy environment, all of those more social and sort of existing infrastructures, of course. So there's a whole range of potential barriers that radically different innovations face, and that has been conceptualized in terms of having a structural competitive disadvantage. So radical innovations that are being developed in niches face quite strong regime selection pressures, which might prematurely select against the selection of those innovations. Yeah, we do see radical change happening, and this is because this has been explained because initially radical innovations tend to develop in protective spaces or niches, which shield these emerging innovations from premature selection, and also enable the nurturing of those innovations in terms of improvement in price performances, in terms of building up social constituencies and actor networks behind these innovations who might do some of the more political work that ultimately is needed to change some of those regime selection environments for the benefit of that innovation to become successful. And the last basic proposition is that socio-technical experimentation in real life conditions can then be used to create and manage niches. So rather than just making use of sort of niches that might be out there, right? So you can actually try and create niches through socio-technical experimentation. That was the basic proposition in this framework. So in the initial work, a lot of attention has been going through analyzing how experimentation can positively influence key enabling niche processes, looking at three processes in particular. So experimentation can bring together actors and shape new social networks that form that social constituency behind a new innovation. And empirical work demonstrated that in particular broad networks covering a range of different stakeholders, as well as deep networks, individuals that can mobilize a larger network to support that particular innovation or to become involved and make the necessary regime changes is another important aspect of networks, but also regime outsiders. So having actors involved that are not constrained by the regime, the incumbent regime that others might be working in, and therefore are more willing to support and think out of the box what might work in the future. Second, articulating and coupling of future expectations. This was drawing on the sociology of expectations literature at the time, and arguing that experimentation can be beneficial to niche development, in particular when expectations are shared, meaning that they are shared across multiple actors, that they are tangible, that experiments actually provide evidence and backup of some of the expectation that initially might be nothing more than just expectations, and specific in the sense that they're able to guide future search directions. And the third and final process is that experiments can facilitate learning, and particular learning that's multidimensional, so beyond the techno-economical dimensions, but also learning that stimulates reflexivity in the sense that it might contribute to challenging or making explicit some of the underlying assumptions or norms that are constituting the normal, and that normal needs to be challenged if these niche experiments are to become successful. So in here, the management part of the strategic niche management framework has always been a little bit limited in some ways. It has been, I guess, mostly used as an analytical framework to understand why or why not particular niches become successful. But some of the original writings did write quite a lot about management recommendations, and I still find these 17 recommendations quite useful for everyone that's interested in setting up an experiment in the context of a strategic niche management approach. This was originally published in a workbook by Matthias Weber and others. And I still think that many of them make sense today, even though it's more than 20 years old. Well, this was sort of the initial 1990s focus of strategic niche management, driven in particular through a European-funded research project on experimenting for sustainable transport. And after that, around 2002, this book was published, and it led to a bit of a negative conclusion in the sense that what was observed from the empirical work on experiments, that single experiments don't lead to regime shifts. So that you can see this in this particular quote from this book. And it turned out that in order for experiments to escape their original niches, that is apparently is taking a lot more time than originally expected, five years or more. So this insight led to another search into and reconceptualization of the strategic niche management framework in terms of looking at the social and innovation dynamics across a portfolio of experiments that were implemented over longer periods of time. I did a little bit of that work myself in my PhD thesis, which looked at the experimental introduction of bioenergy technologies in the Netherlands and Denmark, and that led us to conceptualize, in particular, a local global model of strategic niche management, where we started to make a distinction between the local place-specific experiments that were implemented, whether these are particular pilot projects or what demonstration projects or trials or what we would now call living lab experiments. But then also looking at how insights and knowledge might be, through learning process, might become aggregated into field level expectations, field level rules, field level generic theories and models, which then become a resource for new experiments to draw on and test and trial all the aspects of that particular innovation. And I think this has helped us to better understand over longer periods of time how experiments might contribute to niche development and how that might become eventually influenced, but also is influenced by what happens at the broader regime level as well. And this local global model has later on, I think to some extent, for some good reasons, also been criticized by geographers, because there seems to be sort of a geographical or spatial connotation with these levels. But in this original model, it was the global model was referring to a socio-cognitive level versus a practical particular project level. But I think to some extent the critiques were right that it didn't engage with those geographical or spatial questions, and I'll get back to that later on. Just a quick slide that in parallel to all of this, there's been also developments on around grassroots strategic niche management approaches, emphasizing social experiments and the role of citizen groups and non-governmental organizations that operate outside of the institutional structures of firms and governments. Originally worked from Verheul and Verspakt that looked at this, and later on Jill Sifeng and Adrian Smith and others have really well positioned this difference between, on the one hand, sort of more the market-based strategic niche management perspective that I've talked about a lot until now, versus a more grassroots-based process of experimentation and innovation, and really contrasting the two, and ultimately, I guess, making an argument that the work that these communities and civil society organizations and voluntary associations and all of the sort of the more civil society based work and the innovation that they're doing, that this needs to be recognized a lot more within contemporary innovation policy paradigms, for instance. So I've always found this quite an inspiring piece of literature as well. So I'll move on to some of the extensions that have been made along the way. One area is around the politics of protective space. This was a project that I did with Adrian Smith and also involving Florian Kern and Bram Verhees. And it made it developed a few new ideas building on the original SNM framework, but arguing that protection should be understood in a much more multidimensional way. In the original work, protection was probably seen more sort of in a financial way, or protection through expectations. And here we look more at all the different regime dimensions and trying to understand what protection might mean in that context. We also distinguished between passive and active spaces. So passive spaces, pre-existing niches, let's say an island in the middle of nowhere that doesn't have an incumbent infrastructure for energy generation, provides a great passive space for trialing off-grid energy generating technologies, as an example, versus the more active spaces that looks at the actual creation of niches through, for instance, policy frameworks and incentives. But I guess the core point was to look at protection also as a political process, and extending this what probably was more sort of an inward oriented niche development work, trying to understand how niches developed internally through the actor networks that are being built up, through the learning processes that occurred, and through the alignment of expectations, to also start to look at, but how are these, let's say, niche advocates actually go about and try to win protection for their causes, for their innovations that they want to work on, and how do they go about in terms of trying to change some of the regime selection pressures that might be working against that particular niche innovation. And this is we call empowerment in this case. So adding to the shielding and nurturing aspects of niche development, we also looked at empowerment, and we made a distinction between different types of empowerment narratives. Basically looking at fit and conform as an empowerment narratives, where the narrative is very much competitiveness focused. So we don't need to change regime selection environments. We just need to make sure that we get the prices right and the efficiencies right from these new innovations, and then they will be able to compete within otherwise unchanged regime selection environments. Versus a stretch and transform narrative, which is much more about changing the actual regime selection pressures and referring to institutional reform as a key condition to enable perhaps a more progressive transformation than within the competitiveness and fit and conform narrative. And these are sort of ideal typical narratives, because in reality, if you look at cases, you will always find both of them. It's always a dynamic of both fit and conform and stretch and transform. I'll have one more slide on the sort of the politics side, and this is a recent paper that a student that I'm supervising is in the later phase of her PhD, Suki Lestari-Ioana, and also involving a few other colleagues at Utrecht University. And this is looking at the role of conflict in sort of that outward-oriented political work. And in some ways, it's a bit of a critique at the strategic niche management framework, which tends to be quite consensual. It emphasizes, shared expectations, collaborative learning processes, consensus building as key mechanisms of change. But the reality is change is often fueled by conflicts and controversies. And what this particular work by Joanna does is that it introduces the notion of critical moments into transitions thinking and understanding how niches evolve by saying that there are often particular moments in these longer term processes where actual contestations happen, and that's where we need to look at to understand how conflict is enabling change. And it also draws on Martin Heyer's dramaturgy approach to not just look at these conflicts, but also understand how they are performed and how they are being staged within particular settings and who's controlling those stages, because that will tells us something about the politics of change through conflict. So I can certainly recommend reading this paper by Joanna. So I'll move on to geography of transitions. I think I have to speed up a little bit looking at the clock. Please, Noor, tell me if I'm running out of time. So geography of strategic niche management. This is an area of work that I guess emerged in the context of a broader critique within the transitions field that transition studies hasn't engaged with its geographies, if you like. And that includes strategic niche management. So in essence, here are a few basic references, but in essence, I think it did a couple of things. There's all these notions of place and space, and we had the local global model. And we need to elaborate the geography of these key concepts. That's, I guess, sort of a conceptual agenda that was being worked on. The basic thing that I found really interesting is the point that was being made is that this notion of uneven geography. So with the frameworks, without an engagement with geography, we cannot really understand where transitions happen or where niches emerge and why they're. And it's obvious that there's an uneven geography where some countries or some regions or cities are, accelerating, going ahead with transformations, whereas others are not. And why is that the case? How can we understand that? And then the third point was around going beyond the national. So I guess I critique that much of the transitions research has focused on the national as sort of the apparently natural scale at which transitions happened. But what about the transnational scale? What about regions? What about cities? So a couple of contributions in this area. One paper that we wrote together with Lars Kuhne and Kees Boom, trying to mobilize the notion of proximity, drawing on Ron Bosma's work and a case study in Dutch thermal aquifer storage, using different types of proximity and trying to understand how they might facilitate or work against the formation of niches. Things like cognitive proximity, facilitating learning and alignment of expectations, social proximity, facilitating trust and actor networks, organizational proximity, and particularly highlighting the role of intermediary actors, institutional proximity, and particularly looking at the alignment between institutions across different skills. And finally, geographical proximity, which is sort of the original proximity notion, if you like, which played an important role in this particular case in terms of resource endowments. Having access to thermal aquifers has a strong geographical element in itself. But I think what the paper also did was to not just understand that these forms of proximities are something objective or out there and always existing, but it tried to look at the recursive relationships between agency, experimentation, proximity, and niche development. So experiments can be informed or influenced by these different forms of proximity, but at the same time, they can also create new forms of proximity or shape proximity. And again, that needs to be understood as a recursive relationship over time.
We have last 5 minutes left.
Okay, I'll speed up a little bit. Thank you, Noor. This is a paper by Anna Wieczorek and others looking at the transnational linkages and in the case of 65 solar experiments in India, and demonstrating or finding that for the majority of these experiments, there were all combinations of both domestic actors as well as transnational links available. So we cannot just think of experimentations as happening somewhere local or somewhere national, but they're deeply transnational in nature, at least in this particular field of PV experiments in India that we looked at. This is a paper by Frans Sengers again, drawing on different human geography literatures and trying to understand this multi-scale network of the global diffusion of niche innovations, and particularly looking at this whole bunch of NGOs and highly mobile experts, but also advocates of particular innovation, in this case, bus rapid transit, and how they drive that global diffusion of niche innovation. A recent paper by Manu Tifnim and others, where we drew on a quantitative analysis of place-based factors in 520 nature-based solutions experiments across 100 cities, drawing on the literature of urban experimentation and strategic niche management to identify conceptually which variables matter in terms of explaining novelty as well as the nature of innovation, and empirically identifying what those relationships are. And in some ways, the work confirms initial more qualitative based research, for instance, that stakeholder diversity characterizes more innovative city environments, and that non-traditional innovators such as schools and hospitals stand out as initiating more radical experiments. It also finds that innovative city environments tend to have a wider range of funding structures and facilitates diverse governance arrangements. Interestingly, learning processes were, at least in the data that we had access to, were more or less absent, which is an interesting finding in itself. For the sake of time, I'll skip this part of an institutional perspective, but we can come back to this if we want to. I do want to talk a little bit about SNM in practice and some of the challenges and ambiguities. This is based on a research project in the Netherlands looking at cycling innovation living labs across 4 cities, and trying to confront what we learned in a project of close to 5 years in terms of actually setting up living lab experiments with what we know from literature in this particular field. And we found several things. One of them is that, interestingly enough, the alignment of expectations and the facilitation of learning processes weren't that challenging in this particular case. They were the most challenging. So getting agreement on what matters, which directionality these experiments should take, and what should be learned in these experiments was much more challenging than actually bringing together the individual actors. The bringing together the people wasn't that difficult. We also found that experimentation was deeply shaped by local political agendas and resources. I'll skip a few more, and I'll have a few last slides in order if I can on some of the ongoing work. And for some reason, I got more involved in understanding the role of behavior and people and households in transitions, and to some extent strategic niche management as well. Partially that's because if I'm in MSDR currently, where we both have capabilities in sort of the behavioral change angle as well as in the systems change angle, and we're trying to combine those different expertise in our ongoing strategy. But we also did a recent review on the role of behavior in transitions and how that has been conceptualized so far. And we find that this, in some ways, is quite limited and dominated by one particular perspective on behavior, whereas we say it would be productive to actually take a broader perspective on what behavior is and what role it can play in both enabling as well as limiting transition. We're also working in a 4-year Australian Research Council funded project on net zero precincts with a few partners, including ICLAI and Monash City Council and Engie, which is a French utility, where the proposition is that we can combine transition management with insights from particular design anthropology to improve some of the problems with transition management, in particular how it has engaged with the politics, the people and the place of transitions. And these criticisms are not new, they are actually elaborated in previous literatures, but we think that by drawing on design anthropology and looking at the design for everyday people and experiences, we can come up with a improved form of transition management, in particular in the context of precinct scale or district scale transitions. And this is the final slide looking at another ARC project that's currently ongoing, and this looks at the role of household experimentation and a transition to low waste cities. It's drawing on a wider range of social sciences to open the black box of households and understand the agency of household and householders in transitions. And it took a sort of, it takes a bit of an action research approach as well, to where we have worked with about 23 particular houses to help them co-design their own experiments for a 6-week period, and try to help them learn, and we could learn from those experiments about what are the actual challenges when you would go, for instance, low waste or zero waste for 6 weeks. So I thought this was a quite interesting experiment in itself. I'm currently working through analysis of the findings. I'll stop there. Thank you very much for listening and sticking with me. And I've had all the references on my slides, so I'm happy to share them afterwards if you want to read up on some of those.
Thank you very much, Rob, for that great presentation.